I arrived late for the company dinner for couples, more out of bad luck than distraction. A silly traffic accident, a meeting that went on too long, and before I knew it, the guests were all seated at their tables, smiling into their wine glasses, as if the world outside was of no urgency. I entered discreetly, trying to disguise my lateness with a casual smile. My eyes scanned the room for my wife, and at first I thought she was just waiting, uncomfortable, as she usually is alone in corporate environments. But she wasn't alone. She was with him. It didn't take me more than 2 seconds to recognize that fake, forced smile she always gave her coworkers. But at that moment, it wasn't fake. It was a sincere, wide, surrendered smile. She was genuinely laughing, leaning her body toward his, touching his arm in an almost imperceptible but intimate way. Something inside me froze. I blinked. For a second I believed she was just trying to be polite, to socialize while she waited for me. But when I approached the table, they both froze, as if they had been caught in the exact moment they were committing a sin. That wasn't the embarrassment of someone who had been interrupted in a conversation. It was the surprise of someone who hadn't expected to be caught. They greeted me nervously, and I, without reacting, just greeted them back. I didn't cause a scene. I just walked away. But inside, my whole body was shaking. In the car, the tears came before the anger. Betrayal has a specific taste, bitter and acidic, that burns the throat and weighs on the stomach. I drove aimlessly, trying to digest that the years of marriage, the promises of fidelity, the plans for children and trips, all of that was now just a well-rehearsed farce. I got home, sat on the couch, and stared into space. The emptiness of the silence mixed with the sound of my thoughts, screaming questions that had no answers. How long had it been? Why? What had I done wrong? But after hours there, I understood something. I wasn't going to beg for love. I wasn't going to compete with anyone. And much less try to save a relationship that she herself had already buried. I planned the divorce in silence. Coldly. With precision. The love I felt gave way to an instinct for self-protection that I never imagined I had. I began to cut ties with her without her realizing it. I created a plan to free myself with dignity. And in the middle of this reconstruction, when I was no longer looking for her, she came back. Knocking on my door, eyes swollen, whispering that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. That she didn't know what she was doing, that it was just a slip-up, that I was her everything, her safe haven. But she didn't know that it was too late. Because while she was living her adventure, I started over. I met someone. Someone who gave me back the lightness of small gestures, who listened to me attentively, who laughed at my bad jokes and looked at me as if it were impossible for me to be replaced. When I revealed this, my ex-wife broke down. She stared at me in silence for long seconds, as if she couldn't believe I had moved on so quickly. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was what I had discovered days before the betrayal. I had booked a trip, 7 days in a distant paradise, and there I planned to renew our vows and, more than that, to begin our attempt to build a family. It was my way of saying, I'm ready to be a father, I'm ready for another 30 years with you. She never knew that. She never knew that days before I cheated on her, I planned to get her pregnant on that trip. That this romantic getaway was a secret plan to rekindle what we had and start a new chapter in our lives. And that's the part that hurts the most. She didn't just destroy a marriage. She destroyed a story that was about to be rewritten with even more love. She'll never know how many nights I stayed up choosing the best destination, the best room with a sea view, the playlist that would play at the surprise dinner I had booked. She'll never know that in that place, hidden in a leather case, there was a new, custom-made wedding ring, with the date of the trip engraved on the inside. A ring that never left the bottom of my drawer, until the day I took it out to throw it away. And when she came back crying, begging for forgiveness, saying she wanted another chance, saying she would do anything to get back what we had, I looked into her eyes and realized that there was no us anymore. That the future I imagined for the two of us now belonged to someone else. She asked me if there was another one. I hesitated. Not because I was in doubt, but because I realized that saying yes would be the final blow to her soul. And so I said, "Yes, there is another one. And I'm engaged." She didn't say anything. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just kept quiet. Maybe because, deep down, she knew she deserved it. Or maybe because she had finally understood that, between what she had experienced with her boss and what I had planned with her, there was a chasm that she would never be able to cross again. What she didn't know is that the woman I'm with now, also knew the story. She knew everything. She was the one who, by accident, overheard my conversation in a cafe, when I was venting to a friend. She was the one who approached me, not out of pity, but out of empathy. And she was the one who taught me that true love isn't perfect, but it is loyal. That fidelity isn't an obligation, it's a choice. That respect isn't demanded, it's cultivated. And then, when everything seemed to have been revealed, when I thought there was nothing left to discover, she came to me again. Not to make up, but to confess something. Something that made me rethink the whole story. Something that, if I had known before, maybe would have changed everything. Or maybe not. But what did she tell me that day? And why, even after so much pain, did that revelation still have the power to shake me inside? This is the part of the story that nobody knows yet. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support any type of betrayal. All the stories you hear are fictional, but based on real situations to show, with intensity, how infidelity destroys lives, corrodes families and leaves deep scars. The moral is clear: whoever betrays, sooner or later, pays the price. Now get ready. Because what you are about to hear is a shocking story. Ethan and Julia have always been seen as a couple that seemed to have been carefully shaped by destiny. They met when they were young, when they were both studying business administration at a private university, and from the beginning, their connection was almost immediate. Julia was determined, observant, and endowed with an intelligence that was present in every look. She had the kind of beauty that didn't scream, but imposed itself, elegant, discreet, and captivating. Ethan was the complementary opposite, charismatic, spontaneous, had a sense of humor that was captivating, and a lightness in his gestures that made even difficult moments seem easier with him by their side. Together, they formed a harmonious duo, as if each knew exactly where they began and ended to allow space for the other. They dated for 5 years and married for another 8 years until the events that would change everything. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, in a spacious house with a wooden porch and a well-kept garden, which Ethan made a point of watering every afternoon, as if he were dedicated to maintaining the roots of something greater. The neighbors liked to greet them in the morning, and it was common to see them walking hand in hand in the park, talking about the weekend movie or the backyard renovations they had been planning for months but never had time to do. Julia worked at a multinational financial company, where she had secured a supervisory position after years of intense dedication. She was respected, punctual, competent, admired by her colleagues and also feared for her unwavering sense of ethics. Ethan, on the other hand, worked as a technology project coordinator, with more flexible hours, which made him responsible for a good part of the household chores, something that never seemed to be a burden to him. He always said that taking care of the house meant taking care of both of them, and that made him happy. In the early years of their marriage, they traveled constantly. They visited Paris, walked in the snow in Berlin, watched the sunset in Santorini and got lost together in the narrow streets of Lisbon. At each new destination, they renewed their silent vows that seemed to require no words, only gestures. Ethan always recorded everything with his analog camera, creating handmade albums that they kept as heirlooms. Julia smiled when she saw the photos, but she always added that the true moments were recorded in the heart, not on paper. He laughed and said that he preferred to keep both. As the years went by, however, routine took hold. Julia's workload increased as she moved up within the company. Longer meetings, frequent trips, last-minute shifts. Ethan understood, or at least made an effort to do so. He used to stay up late, with the lights on in the living room and a glass of wine on the table, just to say goodnight with a long kiss. But their schedules started to not coincide, and their conversations became shorter and more practical, like reminders of everyday life. The plumber is coming tomorrow, don't forget your appointment, we need to pay the insurance. The lightness of the conversations was replaced by tacit agreements, where love was still present, but hidden behind obligations and schedules. Still, they continued to believe that their marriage was solid. They planned to have children the following year, when their schedules were more organized. Julia talked about a future with children running around the yard, while Ethan mentally built the nursery, imagining what stories he would read before bed. He bought a book on parenting and kept it in the drawer of his nightstand like a precious secret. She didn't know it yet, but he had already chosen the name he would give her if she had a girl. Julia's company's annual couples dinner was one of the few events where Ethan felt truly out of place. The formal setting, the discussions about metrics and goals, the inside jokes among colleagues who spent the day together, it all bored him, but he never complained. He dressed elegantly, practiced clever remarks, and smiled politely in circles where he could barely be heard. He did it for her, as he did everything. He knew how important it was to Julia that he was there, representing the partnership they had always cultivated. It wasn't about the company, it was about the symbol of presence. A marriage, he said, is also built behind the scenes of invisible sacrifices. In the days leading up to the dinner, Julia was more introspective. She seemed distracted, lost in her own thoughts, but when Ethan asked her if something was wrong, she would respond with a restrained smile, saying only that she was tired. He believed her. He trusted her with the conviction of someone who had never imagined being deceived. The day before the event, he prepared dinner at home, as he did on special nights. Candles, homemade pasta, red wine. She thanked him, said she needed to go to bed early, but kissed him with an old sweetness that left him hopeful that perhaps they were recapturing that something they seemed to have left behind. That night, Ethan felt that Julia was still his. That despite the rush, the occasional coldness, the silences at the end of the day, there was still love, and that was enough. The morning of the dinner began with the two of them getting ready together, laughing at the clothes they were trying on, sharing the mirror, and discussing the news on the radio. It was the most intimate version of the two of them, the silent complicity of someone who shares their life without having to fill every space with words. When she left early to go straight from work, he stayed home, arranging the details of her outfit, sorting out the gift she would take to the night's raffle, and writing, hidden in a card, a note that he intended to discreetly deliver during dessert. In it, he said that he planned to take her to a special place at the end of the month, where they could celebrate their love with the calm that recent times had stolen. The destination had already been chosen, the trip paid for. A place by the sea, with silence, a hammock on the porch, and entire days just for them. What she didn't know yet was that, in that place, Ethan intended to do something he had been keeping in mind for months, renew their wedding vows and start trying to get pregnant. He had even bought new rings, which he had engraved with the phrase she had said on the day they got married, "I choose you." Every day. That was the part that no one saw. The part that he built in silence, while she immersed herself in her work, believing that everything was fine. Ethan believed it too. He believed it so much that he couldn't see the small deviations, the lost glances, the colder returns. He was convinced that everything would go back to normal, all it needed was a push. And that was what that trip represented, the push. The new beginning. The time it took for Ethan to leave the house that night was filled with calm joy. He imagined how she would react when she saw the card, when she heard about the trip. The smile she would give when she knew he still dreamed of a future with her. He didn't know, he didn't suspect, that sometimes, no matter how much you dream together, someone can wake up before the other. And leave. Without warning. Without leaving a sign. But that night, he was still just a man in love, holding a gift in his hands and a plan in his heart. A plan that would not be realized. A plan that, when revealed later, would not bring joy, but pain. And it is at that point, at that exact moment, that everything would begin to change. The evening of the dinner did not start as Ethan had imagined. When he arrived at the hotel ballroom where the company event would take place, he felt that something was out of place. It was not only the delay that bothered him, but the lack of a message, a simple, "Did you arrive well?" from Julia, as she usually did at formal meetings. The elevator took longer than usual, and during the ride to the ballroom he felt a weight in his stomach that he could not name. He had in his hands the carefully wrapped gift for the raffle and the small envelope with the ticket inside his jacket pocket. His steps were slow, but not out of insecurity, but rather out of caution, as if an unconscious part of his body was trying to postpone what he was about to see. The room was full, loud laughter contrasting with the instrumental music that filled the room. Ethan walked with his eyes alert, searching for her among the tables. He saw colleagues smiling, others waving briefly, but no response came from her. Until he finally saw her. And then, time stood still. Julia was sitting, elegant, her hair tied in a bun that exposed her neck, just the way she liked it. She was wearing a black dress of a sober, discreet cut, but perfectly designed for her body. What paralyzed him, however, was not the sight of the woman he loved, but the man in front of him. Sitting with his body leaning towards her, laughing at something he couldn't hear, with a nearly empty wine glass in one hand and the other resting casually on the edge of the table. Julia was smiling. It wasn't a forced smile, of someone trying to be polite. It was a light, real, almost intimate smile. Her eyes shone in a way that Ethan hadn't seen in months, and it pierced him like a shard. For a moment he thought about going back. Making up an excuse, leaving, pretending he hadn't seen anything. But he forced himself to continue. He walked to the table, maintaining his composure, and approached with a restrained smile. They were both startled when they noticed his presence. Julia stood up quickly, almost knocking over her glass, and the man sat up straight in his chair, wiping the corner of his mouth with his napkin as if to erase the closeness of the previous moment. Ethan extended his hand to shake his, maintaining the necessary politeness. Julia tried to ease the tension with a banal comment, but her voice was shaking. The mood had changed. The laughter had stopped. The discomfort was palpable, even among the noise around them. They sat down. Dinner went on like a poorly rehearsed play. Ethan pretended to be focused on the menu, but his mind was racing, putting the pieces together, searching for clues in the details he had previously ignored. Her hands were restless, fiddling with the cutlery and the napkin, avoiding eye contact. She tried to force a conversation, ask about his day, comment on the event, but there was something in her tone that sounded artificial, distant. The man, her boss, now maintained a more formal posture, as if he had been reminded that they were not alone. Ethan wondered how long this had been going on. There was no concrete evidence, just the silent conviction of someone who knows the other person's gestures deeply. And at that moment, he knew he had been surpassed. He didn't need proof. It was all in her eyes. At the end of dinner, the raffle began, and everyone's attention dispersed. Ethan quietly left, saying he had to take an urgent call. He walked down the hotel corridor until he reached a quiet outdoor area, where he could finally take a deep breath. He sat down on a stone bench, resting his elbows on his knees, and stared at the ground. He didn't feel angry. He felt a dull pain, as if something inside him had broken for good. He took the envelope from his pocket, opened it, and reread the note. The words he had written so carefully now seemed ironic. That trip no longer made sense. Julia noticed his absence a few minutes later and went looking for him. When she found him, his face was serene, but his eyes were red. She approached him hesitantly, asking if everything was okay. He said yes, he just wasn't feeling very well. She sat down next to him, trying to touch his hand, but he gently pulled it away. She didn't insist. They sat there in silence, listening to the muffled sound of the music coming from the hall. Ethan didn't confront her. He didn't ask her anything. He just said he wanted to go home. The drive back was almost without words. In the car, Julia tried to make conversation, to tell him something funny about the event, but she realized it was no use. His silence was a wall. In the days that followed, Ethan became more introspective. He continued to be kind and present, but there was a calculated coldness in his gestures. Julia noticed, but didn't comment. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of denial. She started sending more affectionate messages, making impromptu dinners, and doing little favors. But nothing seemed to bridge the distance between them. Ethan, in turn, threw himself into work, reading, and the workouts he had abandoned months before. He rediscovered the pleasure of running in the mornings and started arriving home later, claiming last-minute meetings or commitments. Julia tried to maintain her balance, but the discomfort was growing. One night, while washing the dishes, Ethan noticed a notification light up on the screen of her phone, which was on the counter. It was a short but revealing message. "I'm still thinking about our night. Let me know when you can talk." The sender's name didn't need to be read. He knew the number. He knew the story. And now, finally, he had confirmation. He continued washing the dishes in silence, drying each piece of silverware with the same calmness with which he organized his thoughts. When he was finished, he picked up his phone, deleted the notification, and put it back where it had been. He went upstairs to his room, lay down next to her, and fell asleep. The next day, he left early. He stopped at a distant cafe, ordered a strong coffee and sat down to write. He took out an old notebook, the kind he kept for important projects, and began to write. They weren't rants. They were plans. Lists. Objective thoughts about what he would do from then on. He no longer felt confused. Just a kind of bitter clarity that drove him. The trip was still on, but now, the meaning had changed. It would no longer be a fresh start for the two of them, but rather a starting point for another life. A life in which he would no longer be tied to someone who chose another path without warning. Julia began to notice the change more intensely. His gestures were now calculated, distant, and even when he spoke tenderly, there was an absence in his eyes that she didn't know how to fill. She tried to confront him one night, asking if everything was okay between them. He replied that everything was as it had always been. And that answer hurt more than any fight. Julia knew she had crossed a line, even if she still tried to convince herself that it was reversible. But Ethan's silence weighed heavily. It wasn't the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say. It was the silence of someone who has already said everything internally, and now waits for the moment to act. One afternoon, when Julia arrived home early, she found the bedroom door ajar. She heard the soft sound of the music Ethan used to listen to while he was organizing his things. She walked in slowly and saw the open suitcase on the bed, with carefully folded clothes. Next to it, the envelope with the travel papers and a small black box, still closed. Her heart raced. She went over and read the documents. She recognized the name of the hotel, the romantic itinerary, the special vow renewal package. And then she opened the box. Inside, the rings. 2, new, with an engraving on the inside. She picked one up, read what was written, and felt her legs give out. "I choose you. Every day." That sentence went through her with a silent violence. She sat on the edge of the bed and stayed there, holding the ring between her fingers, trying to understand when she had lost it. When she had exchanged all that for a moment that now didn't even seem so special. She felt the tears flow and knew, for the first time definitively, that she had destroyed something that she might never be able to rebuild. That same night, Ethan arrived later. He found the suitcase closed, the box with the rings in the same place. Julia was waiting for him in the living room, in silence. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek and sat down on the sofa. She wanted to talk, but didn't know where to start. And so, he said just one sentence, with the calm of someone who had already gone through every possible emotion. "I know everything." And that's how, without shouting, without scandals, without dramatic confessions, the betrayal stopped being just a suspicion and became a fact. Irrefutable. Definitive. A point of no return. And deep in Ethan's gaze, there was something even deeper. Something Julia didn't know yet. Something that, when it came to light, would change not only their story, but also what she thought she knew about herself. On that gray Saturday morning, the silence between Ethan and Julia was no longer a space for reflection, but an abyss filled with ill-fitting memories and expectations that never came true. She had spent the previous night in the guest room, even though he hadn't said a single word to tell her to. It was as if they both knew that there was no more room for empty attempts or belated apologies. Julia woke up before sunrise and spent hours sitting on the edge of the bed, holding between her fingers the ring he had once bought for a new beginning, and which now represented everything she had destroyed with her silent choices. Her eyes were swollen, her expression tired, but there was something in her expression that reminded her of pure regret, not just guilt. True regret, of something that could never be undone. Ethan, on the other side of the house, was drinking his cold coffee, staring at the screen of a tablet with reservations for flights he would no longer use. The trip was still paid for, the dates confirmed, but the destination was now different, not just geographical, but emotional. He had decided that there was no point in feeding the ghosts of a love she had let die alone. What drove him now was not revenge, but the raw need for liberation. He had spent sleepless nights imagining all the ways he could confront Julia, rehearsing monologues that mixed pain and contempt, but now that the moment was here, he realized he didn't need to raise his voice. The truth would speak for him. At noon, Julia walked slowly down the stairs, stopping in front of him in the kitchen. He didn't move. He remained seated, staring at the cup as if he could find in it the answer to all the questions that still hurt. Julia took a deep breath and asked if they could talk. Ethan nodded slightly and got up, going into the living room. She followed him and they sat on opposite ends of the couch, like two strangers who didn't know where to begin. The air between them was thick, as if all the unspoken words formed an invisible wall. Julia was the first to speak. She said she knew she had hurt him deeply and that there was no excuse that could erase that. She didn't expect immediate forgiveness, but that she needed to tell him everything. She said that what happened with her boss was a terrible mistake, born of need, of a moment of weakness, of an emptiness that she herself couldn't justify. She said that it didn't mean love, it didn't mean plans, just an impulse that destroyed everything. Ethan listened to everything in silence, his eyes fixed on her, as if trying to see beyond the surface of her words. When she finished, he remained silent for a few seconds, until finally he asked, in a dry, firm voice, if that was all. Julia hesitated. She lowered her eyes, clasped her hands on her knees, and then shook her head. It was at that moment that he knew. There was still something more. Something she hesitated to say, not because it was irrelevant, but because it might be even more devastating than the betrayal itself. Ethan stood up slowly, walked over to the living room furniture, and took a white envelope out of one of the drawers. He walked back to the couch and placed it on the coffee table, pushing it toward her. Julia looked at the envelope and, with a confused look, asked what it was. Ethan replied that, before everything happened, he had planned something for them. That he had made a reservation, bought new rings, written a note, all with the intention of giving her what she said she wanted so much, a fresh start, maybe even a child. He said it in a choked voice, but without tears. Julia opened the envelope with trembling hands, read the note and the details of the trip, and when she saw the dates, covered her face with her hands, as if she wanted to disappear. She whispered a barely audible apology, but Ethan only said that it no longer made sense now. That all he needed was an honest answer. When exactly did it start? That was when Julia looked into his eyes, tears streaming down her face, and finally confessed. She said that their first kiss had happened 3 days before he confirmed the purchase of the trip. That she felt something broken inside her, an absence she couldn't name, and that in that fragile moment she allowed someone to get close. But then she hesitated again. She swallowed hard. Ethan noticed and insisted. He said that if he was going to put everything on the table, he should do it now. And that was when Julia let slip what she had been holding back for so long. She said it wasn't just a physical mistake. It wasn't just a passing betrayal. She said she and her boss had started seeing each other more often, but that one night, while Ethan was out of town at a work conference, she had made a rash decision. She said that night, her boss had taken her to a cabin on the outskirts of town. She said they had drunk wine, talked about everything, that he had made her laugh like she hadn't laughed in a long time, and that she, driven by that impulsive feeling of freedom and self-affirmation, had made a decision she had never made with Ethan. She looked him in the eye and said that night she had planned to tell Ethan, when he returned, that she wanted some time. That she had considered ending the marriage to live something new, even though she wasn't sure what she was doing. Ethan just watched, without moving. He didn't react. And that was when she finished telling him. She said that same night, while he was getting ready for an important lecture, she wrote him a message saying that she needed to have a serious conversation. But she didn't send it. Instead, she put away her phone, went to the bathroom, looked in the mirror and realized that she couldn't imagine her life without him. That it was all an escape. That the other man wasn't love, he was just a distraction from what she herself had failed to build within herself. She said that the next day, when she saw him arrive home with a light smile, bringing flowers and talking about the surprise trip, her heart sank. That she wanted to give up on everything right then and there, that she tried to go back to being the woman he loved, but the damage had already been done. And then, with a choked voice, Julia revealed what Ethan never imagined he would hear. She said that night in the cabin, they didn't protect themselves. That she hadn't taken any precautions. And that, a few days later, when she noticed she was late, she took a pregnancy test by herself, without telling anyone. She said the test was negative, but that for 2 whole days, she thought she might be pregnant. And what destroyed Ethan wasn't the fact that she had slept with another man, but the fact that she had considered carrying a child that wouldn't be his, and still kept the truth from her. She said she cried with relief when she saw the result, but that at that moment she understood how deep she had gone. That she had crossed all the lines. And that she could never erase that from her memory. Ethan stood, put his hand over his mouth. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in many years, he let a tear fall without trying to hide it. Not because of the possible pregnancy. But because he had discovered that, while he was preparing a future for them both, she had almost brought another life into the world, a life that would be sustained by a lie. Julia approached, knelt before him, held his hands and told him that she loved him, that despite everything, she loved him. That she had lost herself, but that she wanted to find him again. That she was willing to do anything. Ethan looked at her like someone who was once everything, but is now just a reflection. He said he still loved her, and that was the cruelest part. Because even though he loved her, he knew he could no longer trust her. And without trust, there was no new beginning. His pain was real, but so was his decision. And then he walked away. He went up to his room, grabbed his suitcase, and when he came back down, he simply said that he needed time. She tried to stop him, but she knew it was no use. Julia stood there, in the middle of the room, watching the man she loved walk out the door. And as the sound of the key turning in the lock echoed down the hallway, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The next few days were a dull mix of displacement and silence. Ethan didn't go home that week. He stayed in a small apartment he had rented for occasional company meetings, and there he spent the days trying to reorganize his thoughts. It wasn't an escape, it was an attempt to find a neutral space, where memories wouldn't suffocate him in every room. The place was simple, unadorned, almost impersonal, which helped make the emotional state more bearable. He no longer cried. The pain, which had been incandescent before, now transformed into something darker, denser, as if a part of him had died, and mourning that piece of his heart made him move in slow motion. He tried to maintain his routine with almost mechanical precision, waking up early, running, eating, answering emails, reading. But nothing was really lived, only passed through. Meanwhile, Julia remained in their house, alone. She spent hours in silence, walking the halls, touching objects with silent nostalgia. She wore his clothes, listened to the playlists he used to listen to while he cooked. She tried, somehow, to get closer to what she had lost, but now without the comfort of contact, without the possibility of immediate forgiveness. The confession had been devastating, not only for him, but for her as well, because now she felt the true extent of the destruction she had caused. What had previously seemed like just an emotional mistake had revealed itself as an irreversible rupture with the life they had built. She knew that, with each day that Ethan stayed away, the distance between what they had been and what they would never be again grew wider. On a rainy Tuesday, Ethan decided to visit his mother, who lived in a city about 2 hours away. He hadn't seen his mother in months, always putting it off with the excuse that he was in a rush. But now he felt like he needed that comfort, even if it was unspoken, even if it was just in silence. The woman welcomed him with a long hug, no questions asked. She prepared his favorite meal, put tea on the table, and let him talk whenever he wanted. And it was only at the end of the night, after a long conversation about childhood, memories, and regrets, that Ethan shared his story. He didn't mention sordid details, just the essentials. When he finished, his mother simply held his hand and said that sometimes true love isn't enough when you lose respect. And that moving on, even if you still love, is one of the most human and courageous decisions someone can make. Ethan returned to the apartment that night with a lighter mind, as if those words had lifted some of the weight he carried on his chest. The following weekend, he accepted an invitation from an old friend to a charity event. He wasn't in the mood for parties, but the idea of getting out of that emotional limbo drove him. The venue was a cultural center with a photography exhibition and a small jazz performance. It was there, between a casual conversation about art and a comment about wines, that he met Elena. She was an art curator, passionate about Russian literature, and had a calm gaze that demanded nothing but offered presence. Ethan talked to her as if he were remembering the pleasure of being at peace. There were no sparks, no promises, just a tacit understanding of two worlds crossing at the right time. Over the next few days, they kept talking, exchanging messages, arranging coffee dates. And little by little, without realizing it, Ethan was rediscovering the value of small discoveries. Meanwhile, Julia finally decided to take action. She could no longer bear the feeling of being on the sidelines of her own life. She called Ethan and asked to see him. He hesitated, but agreed. They arranged to meet for coffee late on a Friday afternoon. The meeting took place in a neutral place, far from the house where they lived, and they both arrived with serious expressions. Julia was visibly thinner, with dark circles under her eyes, but she had a firm stance. She began by saying that she did not expect to get back together, nor try to force anything, but that she needed to say certain things before it was too late. She apologized again, but this time not with the weight of someone who expects to be forgiven, but with the dignity of someone who understands the extent of the damage she had caused. She said that he was the best man she had ever known, and that she would regret losing him every day of her life. Ethan listened to her attentively. When she finished, he took a deep breath and responded calmly. He said he still loved her, but that love wasn't enough. He spent months trying to understand what he could have done differently, until he realized it wasn't about him. That she had lost herself alone, and now she needed to find herself alone too. Julia lowered her eyes, holding back tears. She said she was starting therapy, that she wanted to rebuild herself as a woman, as a human being. Ethan nodded softly. He said he was rooting for her. And then, in a moment of painful honesty, he confessed that he was meeting someone. That it was recent, slight, but real. Julia closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the blow, and then, with a choked voice, she said she hoped he would be happy. That he deserved it. After that encounter, the two went their separate ways. Ethan allowed himself to live his relationship with Elena with caution and sincerity. It was not a leak, nor a replacement. It was a new beginning, built on ruins that he had cleaned up with his own hands. Elena respected his pace, never demanded more than he could give, and gradually filled the gaps without invading anything. Julia, on the other hand, immersed herself in a process of deep self-discovery. She quit her job, traveled alone for a few weeks, wrote letters that she never sent. She began dedicating herself to social projects, as a way of reconnecting with something greater than her own pain. Months passed. Until an unexpected invitation arrived in Ethan's email inbox. It was an invitation to a wedding. Julia was going to marry herself. Literally. A small, symbolic event, with a few friends and family, where she would declare her self-love and a new beginning. An intimate ceremony, without pomp, but with a lot of meaning. He stood transfixed in front of the screen. He didn't know if he should go, but deep down, he understood that this wasn't about her, it was about him too. He accepted. He went to the event with Elena. He sat in the last chairs, watched Julia go up on the small stage and read her vows of a new beginning with tears in her eyes. She didn't see him. Or if she did, she pretended not to see him. But at the end of the ceremony, their eyes met for an instant. And in that brief moment of silence between two worlds that loved each other so much, they both knew that this was the end. The end of a love story, but the beginning of something new for both of them. On the way home, in the car, Ethan held Elena's hand firmly. He said he wanted to take her to that place on the trip he never took. That he wanted to start building something real from then on, without rushing, without fear, but with everything he had learned. Elena smiled, not like someone who wins a dispute, but like someone who welcomes a restored heart. And it was like that, without having to erase the past, that Ethan finally understood that life does not reward those who do not suffer. But it rewards those who do not give up on themselves. After Julia's symbolic ceremony, Ethan's world seemed to finally come together. The image of her, dressed in white, smiling with teary eyes as she declared her self-love, would remain etched in his memory not as a ghost of what they had experienced, but as a reminder that pain, when accepted, can also be a portal to redemption. It was no longer about judging who had made the biggest mistake, who had given up first, or who had hurt more deeply, but rather about understanding that love sometimes requires goodbyes in order to blossom in a different way, even if it never comes from the same roots. Ethan left the place with a calm heart, something he had not felt for a long time. Elena by his side did not pressure him, did not ask questions, she simply walked with him in complicit silence, as if respecting the emotional journey of someone who is still healing the scars of an emotional battlefield. In the days that followed, Ethan began to reorganize his life more consciously. He no longer lived on impulse, nor on autopilot. The choices he made had weight, intention, a care that perhaps I had not noticed before. The apartment he shared with Elena began to take on a more personal touch. With her artistic sensibility, she brought life to the spaces, but she respected each old object, each memory of his past. He never tried to replace anything. He never questioned the memories. He simply lived with them, until, naturally, the new took the place of the old. Ethan, in turn, reciprocated with attention. He listened more, spoke more deeply, revealed thoughts that he had previously kept hidden in secret layers. He had learned, through pain, that silence is also a type of betrayal when it hides what should be shared. Julia, on the other hand, began to live with a more inward-looking intensity. She opened a small therapeutic writing studio, where she guided other women to use words as a healing tool. Her case, which was never exposed in detail, inspired others to talk about trauma, loss, abandonment and guilt. From her own mistake, she built a new purpose. She still loved Ethan, and that was undeniable, but she had understood that love does not always translate into return. Sometimes, the best way to love someone is to set them free not to come back. Some nights, she would take out the old letters he had written, read them in silence, cry, and then put them away again. They were relics of a life that was, and that should never have been forgotten, only understood. The dilemma began to emerge when Ethan was invited to participate in a panel on emotional ethics and healthy relationships, promoted by an NGO that dealt with mental health. The invitation came from an old college friend who had been following his personal journey on social media and admired the honest way he spoke about overcoming obstacles. The proposal was to share his experience without naming names, preserving the identities of the people involved. Ethan hesitated. He didn't know if he was ready to turn his pain into a public speech. But after talking to Elena, who encouraged him with serenity and empathy, he decided to accept. For days, he prepared his speech, not with the intention of exposing anyone, but of showing how betrayal, more than an act of disloyalty, is a moral fracture that reverberates in deeper layers than one might imagine. He spoke about reconstruction, internal forgiveness, and the importance of understanding that no one betrays only the other, but themselves first. The event was moving. At the end of the talk, a woman from the audience approached him in tears, saying that after years of silence, she had finally found the courage to leave an abusive relationship. Ethan wasn't looking for that kind of return, but he understood that sometimes our most painful story is the bridge to someone's freedom. That same week, a cultural journalist published an article about the event, and even without naming names, the subtext reached Julia. When she read the text, she felt proud, but she was also overcome by a deep uneasiness. Because she knew that, even though she had moved on, a part of her had not yet fully forgiven herself. And the fact that Ethan was now an example of public overcoming, while she remained only a figure of private regret, destabilized her. The following week, Julia decided to write a letter. Not to Ethan, but to herself. A letter that I would keep as a kind of final marker. He wrote with brutal sincerity, without embellishments, without defense. He took responsibility for all the choices, all the omissions, all the silences that screamed between them when there was still time to change. She admitted that she had not cheated only out of emotional weakness, but out of selfishness, because she lacked the courage to face her dissatisfaction in the marriage head-on. He said in that letter that he had never been the victim in the story, although he had often pretended to be one in order to survive his own guilt. And when he signed it, he did not apologize, nor did he try to end with a poetic phrase. He simply wrote, "I am another person now. But I was that one." That same day, Ethan received an unexpected job offer in another city. A social innovation project linked to technology and education, something he had always dreamed of developing. The idea of changing, of leaving the place where everything had happened, began to sound like a natural outcome. He talked to Elena about the possibility, and to his surprise, she didn't hesitate to support him. She said she would go along with him, without reservations, and that perhaps it would be good for them to start over, far from the memories that still lingered in the most banal places, like the corner cafes or the streets they used to walk. Ethan didn't respond right away. He needed to process it. He spent that night reflecting, walking around the city, revisiting places that had once been the scene of simple joys. As he passed by the old restaurant where he proposed, he felt his chest tighten, but not with pain, but with understanding. Some stories end exactly where they began. And that's okay. In the last few days before the move, Ethan decided to write an email to Julia. It wasn't an open letter, nor an attempt to get anything back together. It was a necessary closure. In the email, he said that he held no grudges. That she had been the great love of his life, but that now, the great love of his life was himself. He said that he understood her choices, and that he deeply wanted her to find everything she was looking for, but in peace, without guilt. Julia responded with a simple, "Thank you." And in that word, without adjectives, without justifications, there was mutual relief. The day of the move arrived with a clear sky, almost symbolic. Ethan closed the apartment door with Elena by his side, and as he walked down the stairs, he didn't look back. Not out of coldness, but because he knew that to truly move forward, you have to look only at where you want to be, not where you left off. In the car, Elena held his hand, and together, they set off towards their new destination. But fate, as always, still had one last unexpected twist in store. One last reflection of the past about to cross the path before the story ended in a suit. A revelation that had not yet been made, a piece of the puzzle that they both thought they had already put together completely. Something still hung in the air, not like a weight, but like a whisper waiting to be heard. And this revelation, when it came, would not change the paths taken, but would reveal what really remained deep down, untouched, among everything that was said, felt, and hidden. The car had been driving along the highway for over 3 hours when Ethan noticed that the silence between him and Elena was not uncomfortable. It was serene. Her fingers rested gently on his thigh, without demands, without pressure. The radio played a low, melancholic song, and there was a feeling in the air that was not of departure, but of beginning again. The new city represented more than a professional opportunity, it was a chance to redefine limits, to rebuild everything on a new basis, with a new intention. And, more than that, it was the materialization of the courage to leave behind something that, however immense it had been, no longer fit in the present. But even with everything new ahead, there was a strange feeling that history had not yet said its last word. It was as if the past was whispering, not to be relived, but to be closed definitively. When they arrived, they settled into a modest, well-lit apartment with large windows and a view of the river. Elena quickly began decorating the space with her watercolors and books, and Ethan devoted himself to organizing the makeshift office. The first few weeks were peaceful, marked by simple lunches on the balcony, evening walks, and small routines that gradually shaped the new life they were building together. Still, there were times when he would get lost in thought, staring at a fixed point in the landscape as if waiting for something he couldn't even name. Elena, sensitive as always, respected his silences without trying to fill them, but one night, after he returned from a particularly intense day of meetings, she called him to the couch and told him, with firm sweetness, that he didn't need to hide that there were still pieces of the past reorganizing themselves inside him. That loving him also included accepting that he had been broken, and that there was no rush to put everything back together. Ethan hugged her, as if thanking her without words, and stayed there for minutes, breathing in the tranquility of finally being with someone who understood the timing of the heart. Then, one Saturday morning, a box arrived in the mail. The sender was a relative, an old friend who had been part of the same group he and Julia had frequented in the early years of their marriage. Ethan opened the box with curiosity and found inside a worn leather folder with some documents, notes, and a flash drive. There was also a handwritten letter. The friend explained that, when he had been clearing out his recently deceased aunt's house, he had found the folder hidden on one of the shelves in the office, and when he saw the names on the papers, he realized that they should be returned to him. He said he didn't know if it meant anything important, but that he thought Ethan would know what to do. Ethan froze. He had forgotten about the folder. It was part of an old book project that he and Julia had started together in the early years of their marriage, something intimate, where they wrote down thoughts, dialogues, and ideas for characters inspired by the two of them. They had a habit of writing fictional letters to each other, as if they were characters in a parallel story. But what caught his attention was the flash drive. They had never used technology in the project, everything was written by hand. He connected the device to his laptop and found only a video file. He pressed play, with a heavy heart. The image was shaky at first. Then it stabilized, revealing Julia. Her face was serious, her hair tied up in a mess, and she looked nervous. She looked at the camera for a few seconds before starting to speak. She said she didn't know if he would ever see it, but that she needed to record it before she lost her courage. The recording was dated 2 weeks after the official separation. And in the following minutes, she broke down. She said that she had discovered, months before the betrayal came to light, that Ethan had ordered an exclusive necklace from a goldsmith in the city. It was a unique piece of jewelry, custom-made, with a stone that she had casually mentioned in a conversation. Ethan had planned to give the necklace along with the invitation to the trip and the new rings. But she found the receipt by chance, before any revelation. And the most devastating thing, she realized that, even before the betrayal, he still loved her with a purity that she could no longer reciprocate. She said the necklace was never delivered because she returned it to the goldsmith, silently, without saying anything to Ethan, as if rejecting a gift she knew she didn't deserve. The video continued with painful confessions. Julia said that during her brief affair with her boss, she had written a farewell letter to Ethan, detailing the reasons why she wanted to break up, but she hadn't had the courage to deliver it. She said that she still had the letter, and that if he was watching the video, it meant that, in some way, she still hoped he would understand. And then she took a yellowed envelope out of her pocket, opened it with trembling hands, and began to read it out loud. Her words were harsh, but incredibly lucid. She said that she didn't blame him for anything, that the problem was never him. That his love was too great, and that she had lost herself trying to live up to something she never had the courage to live fully. That, instead of asking for help or confessing her doubts, she preferred to keep quiet and pretend. And that this was the most serious mistake, having lied by omission, by cowardice. Ethan closed his laptop before the video ended. He didn't need to hear the end. He had already understood the essentials. That recording didn't change the facts, but it revealed a layer of pain he had never considered. It wasn't an excuse. It was the raw truth of someone who was finally facing his own monsters. He remained silent for hours, walking along the porch, looking at the landscape. Elena arrived and, upon seeing his expression, simply approached him and hugged him. He told her everything, calmly, without hiding anything. She listened to him attentively, asked few questions and, in the end, said that perhaps that was the real ending. That in order to move forward, he needed to hear the version of the story he had never had access to. And that now, knowing everything, he could choose what to do with this truth. That night, Ethan wrote a letter. Not to Julia. Not to Elena. But to himself. A kind of intimate ritual of release. He wrote down everything he felt, everything he carried and everything he no longer wanted to carry. He tore up the letter after he finished it and threw the pieces into the river the next day. The wind carried the words away, like a whisper that could finally be silenced. Days later, walking with Elena through a street market, he felt something different. It wasn't explosive joy, nor euphoria. It was peace. A serenity that only comes when you look back and there's nothing left to hurt, nothing left to say. When you reach the end of the road and can finally breathe without weight. When he took Elena's hand, there was no shadow of comparison, no projection. There was only the present. And that was enough. But fate had one final move in store. When he returned home that afternoon, Ethan received a notification. A new email. It was from Julia. Short, to the point. It simply said, "I went to get the necklace back. I kept it for myself, not as a reminder of us, but as a symbol of what I lost by not knowing how to love properly. I hope you found yours." Ethan smiled. A slight, accepting smile. He didn't answer. There was no need. The story was finally ready to end. The following spring, the river that ran through Ethan's new city seemed fuller, reflecting the late afternoon light as if nature was also allowing itself to begin again. The days had become more predictable, but not in the routine sense, predictable in their peace, in their silent harmony. Elena was now a deep and solid part of his life, not as a replacement for an old love, but as a presence that allowed Ethan to rediscover himself as a man, as a partner, as someone capable of believing in love again without the shadow of unresolved traumas. His work was going well, the social projects he had designed with vulnerable young people were beginning to bear fruit, and in every conversation, in every idea developed, there was a trace of the pain that had once torn him apart, now transformed into a tool to lift up others who had also been broken. Ethan no longer sought meaning in what had happened, he simply respected the path as part of what had shaped him. Julia, on the other hand, had begun to live with a different intensity. After recording the video and sending the final email, something inside her really went silent. Not guilt, that still surfaced from time to time, like an echo, but the need to try to fix what she knew had been broken. Her writing studio grew more than she could have imagined. Women of different ages and backgrounds approached her, bringing stories that, in an almost symbolic way, mirrored her own. Julia listened to them patiently, guided them through emotional reconstruction exercises, and, without their knowledge, used those sessions as a way to continue healing herself. He never got involved with anyone again. Not because of bitterness or endless mourning, but because she understood that, before allowing herself to love again, she needed to truly love who she was now, without masks, without artifices, without the constant feeling of inadequacy that once made her stray from the path. She still kept the necklace. She didn't wear it, but she kept it on the studio table as a subtle reminder of what is lost when you don't choose with your whole heart. One morning, while walking through a book fair, Julia saw a banner for a book with Ethan's name on it. It was a novel inspired by real experiences, as the subtitle said. There was a line for autographs, people commenting on the impact of the narrative, and a small crowd waiting to hear the authors talk. Julia hesitated. She didn't know if she should approach. But something pushed her. She stopped at the side of the tent, between columns of books, and saw him. Ethan was more mature, his gaze more serene, his smile restrained and sincere. He spoke to the audience with a clarity that conveyed truth. He said that love is, above all, a constant decision. That it's not just about feeling, but about choosing someone every day. And that when that choice is broken, what you lose is not only the other person, but a part of you that may never recover in the same way. Julia didn't wait for the end. He left before the applause, with tears in his eyes, but also with a small smile, because he knew that, in some way, he had contributed to getting there. The following week, Ethan received a proposal to expand his work with emotional education through literature, involving public schools in several cities. The project would require constant travel, lectures, and interaction with young people who had never learned to deal with feelings. Elena, as always, supported him. But she went further. She said she wanted to be part of it not only as a companion, but as someone who also had something to teach. And so, together, they transformed the pain of a past that almost crushed them into a fertile present, full of purpose. The love between them was not spectacular, but it was firm. They did not live on memories or explosions, but on small daily decisions that solidified the relationship as a construction that resisted time and ghosts. A year later, they returned to the city where it all began, not as a sentimental return, but because of a conference where Ethan would speak. As they passed in front of the old house, he asked Elena to stop the car. She spent a few minutes observing the place that had once been synonymous with everything. There was no more pain, just a distant memory. At the gate, a new couple decorated the entrance with flower pots. Life went on. And that, more than any words, was the greatest proof that time really does have the power to heal what seems incurable. Julia, on the second anniversary of her symbolic ceremony, held an intimate event in the studio. She read excerpts from letters she never sent and, for the first time, shared excerpts from her own story with some of her students. She didn't mention names, but she sincerely described each pain, each loss, and, most importantly, each choice. At the end, one of the students asked her if she regretted anything. Julia smiled, looked at the necklace on the table and said yes, but that regret no longer paralyzed her. Today, she understood that not every mistake needs to be condemned forever, as long as it teaches. And that her biggest mistake was not telling the truth when there was still time. Years passed. Ethan and Elena had a daughter. They named her Clara, in honor of the light they found after the darkness. Julia published a book of chronicles about the many ways to start over, under a pseudonym. The book was a hit among women who were searching for meaning after great losses. They never saw each other again. They never exchanged a word. But somewhere inside them, they knew that their love, no matter how much it had been hurt, had taught them the deepest of feelings, the courage to move on even after chaos. And maybe that's the true ending. Not every love story has to end with a reunion. Sometimes the most fair ending is one where each person finds their own truth and learns to live with it. Now, comment here what you thought of this story. We want to know your opinion. What would you do in the character's place? Do you believe that some wounds heal forever? Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new stories like this. And remember, betrayal destroys. It tears apart love, tears apart trust, and undermines everything that was built with effort, dedication, and truth. Betrayal is not a casual mistake, it is a choice. And every choice has a price. This channel does not support, encourage or romanticize any form of cheating. Our mission here is to show, with impactful stories, how it affects lives and leaves marks that no one forgets. Until the next story.